It's art, it's art, it's art, it's art, it's art. It's time for art! Hi, everybody. My name is Miss Howell, and I am an art teacher with Houston ISD. And you and I are going to get to spend the next 30 minutes or so together making art and learning about art. Let's get started. First things first. I'm going to do art with some materials that you might not have at your house. And you know what? That's okay. You can do the best you can with whatever you have, or you can just watch and then later, if you get some of the materials, maybe you'll remember what we did together. Either way, I hope you have a good time and you learn something about art. Second thing second, this lesson is made for pre-K through second grade, but really anybody can do it. Anybody who's young at heart or a lifelong learner or who loves art will be able to participate and have a good time. Go get your stuff, go get your stuff, go get your stuff. Go get your stuff, go get your stuff, go get your stuff. Hello friends, I'm so glad to see you again. Today we're talking about quilting. Making a quilt is really the process of making a design and a plan, and then cutting out pieces of fabric, stitching them together, and then stitching those pieces together to make something like a blanket. But it's actually the stitches themselves that are the quilting. And those stitches can be done by hand or by machine, and often the stitches are the really important piece of the art. A quilt is really a fabric sandwich. It has a top layer of fabric, which is usually where the pattern is. Then it has a middle layer of puffy, what's called batting. And it's a squishy layer of fabric that helps make it warm and soft and snuggly. And then there's a bottom layer of fabric. And the important part of quilting is stitching it all together so it stays put. Quilts are made all over the world, literally the entire globe. Every culture, every country has some kind of quilting. Usually, when we think about quilts, we think about big, like, blankets that you put on your bed. But this is a beautiful piece of art that hangs on the wall. This is a saddle. And this is something that ladies used to wear under their other clothes when it was cold. The quilting helped keep them warm. This was a winter dress, and the quilting would keep you warm when you were outside or in the house with no heat. This is for going ice skating. And this was a robe, a house robe from Japan. You can see the beautiful details that have been added on the outside of the quilting. Often you can add stitches just to make it pretty, or even beads and other kinds of designs. Some quilts are made in one color, and it's all about the stitches. Quilts are a way that people could be creative and actually make something that they could use. They come in tons of different kinds of patterns and colors and all kinds of cool designs. These are amazing pieces of art that would have taken the artists hundreds of hours to make, putting all of those pieces of fabric together in all those different designs. Do you see any patterns? You should see a lot of patterns. Do you see any shapes that you recognize? You should see a lot of shapes. Quilting is kind of like math and art put together. It's a really beautiful kind of math and art put together. But I don't want you to think that quilting is just for old people or from the olden days. People do quilting still, even today. There are some very famous quilters who use fabrics to tell stories and get their emotions across and express themselves. And now digital quilting is a thing. That's when you use the computer instead of a sewing machine or your hand with some thread and a needle. We're going to use our paper and our colors to make a kind of a quilt square, or a mock-up of a quilt square, since most of us don't have fabric and sewing machines at home. This kind of quilt would have been made by a bunch of different people, and they each would have made one of those fancy squares and then gotten together to have a party to stitch them all together. Okay, I'm going to get started with some folding. So the first thing I'm going to do is take one corner of my paper and I'm going to fold it up. I'm going to make sure my edges match up at the top, and I'm going to fold that paper down. One more time. Take the corner and pull it up to the top. Make sure my edges are the same, and then fold my paper down. Okay, third time. Let me show you again. I just took my paper edge and I pulled it up to the top to match it up, and I folded it down. I can use my marker or my hand to make sure that my edge is nice and crispy. Then I'm going to take the corner, the by itself corner all the way up here, and I'm going to fold it down to the other corner. See how I'm making kind of a triangle? And I'm going to fold that edge down too and make that edge nice and crispy. I'm using my fingernail this time, but I can use my marker. Just folding it down. Now I'm just going to take that extra part and cut it off. I'm going to cut it right off. I'm cutting very carefully, so I'm just cutting near the triangle. I don't want to cut through the triangle. There we go. Now I have a long skinny rectangle and a folded up triangle. And when I open up my triangle, now I made a square. Do you see how I can use 4 triangles to make a square? That's amazing. Okay, now let's make the design. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to trace over the top of my fold lines. So I'm going up on the one triangle. Look, this square is made out of 2 big triangles. Do you see how I'm using that extra piece of paper to make it so I'm not drawing on the desk? That's a good idea. And then I'm going on the other triangle. How many triangles do you see now? Oh, let's finish the rest of it. Now, here we go. We've got 4 triangles that are making up our square. Now I'm going to draw some lines inside of my triangle. First, I'm tracing the edge. So there's a line on the edge of my paper. I'm going to do that all the way around on all 4 sides. So here's side number 2. Side number 3. And side number 4. Okay. So now I'm just going to make some more lines on the insides of my squares. I'm going up about 1 inch, and I'm drawing a straight line from one side of the triangle to the other side. And then I'm going up about 1 inch and drawing another line. It kind of looks like stairs. It kind of looks like that log cabin pattern, but not quite. This is probably a pattern that somebody made, but I haven't seen it yet. But it will be fun to color and add patterns to later on. Then I'm gonna draw more lines around the rest of the sides that match up. I'm doing my best to make sure that my lines are matching up all the way around. Okay, keep drawing lines all the way around. Over spring break, my family got together with my mom because my mom collects quilts. Sometimes I like to call her the crazy quilt lady. She's like a museum of quilts. This is my mom. We call her Gamma. This is Bennett. That's my oldest. He's my son. That's Kaylin. She's my youngest. She's in middle school. That's Ella. She's our friend. Zoe's over there. She's my middleest. She's in high school. And that's me behind the camera. You won't see me in these pictures. Gamma met up with us so that we could show you her quilts. These quilts that she collects are all made by hand. Do you see those tiny white stitches? That's how you know they were made by hand instead of a machine. That makes them special. This quilt was given to my mom by her grandmother. Look at the back. It's kind of fun. My great grandmother made all of these little stitches of fabric all by herself. It's amazing. This is called a starburst quilt, and those triangles in the middle are hard to put together. But look at all the cool stitches and the cool colors. And my favorite part of this quilt is the edges. Look at those lines that are made out of rhombuses or sideways squares all stitched together. I love it. Did I tell you Gamma has a lot of quilts? I mean a lot of quilts. I mean, a really lot of quilts. She loves them, and so do I. While we were together, we visited the Texas Quilt Museum. It's an amazing place for people who love this kind of art. Let's use that first square that we made kind of as a guide to help us make another quilt square. This time, I want to make something fun in the middle, like a dinosaur. But I want to have a border, or almost like a picture frame, around my quilt square. So do you see how I put my first square underneath and I can see those lines? I'm tracing the outside lines that I made. Tracing is when you're using the lines that are peeking out from underneath to design your quilt square. Then I'm gonna draw a dinosaur. A simple dinosaur. Remember, we're pretending like we're making this out of fabric. You wouldn't make it too complicated. And then a few simple decorations to make my dinosaur. One dinosaur eyeball. A dinosaur nose. Some spiky dinosaur spikes because he's an herbivore, he's a plant eater. You don't want all those meat-eating dinosaurs to eat him. So he has a few spikes to make him crunchy and pokey. So maybe somebody doesn't. And some dinosaur toes. And now I can use that first quilt square again as a guide. I'm going to trace all the way around to make a picture frame again, and then I'm going to make a different quilt square in the middle. I'm finding the center, and I'm going to make a circle in the middle. This time I'm making a flower. Then I'm making some simple petals on my flower across from each other. And I turn my paper and make some more petals across from each other. I wonder what colors I'm going to use to color this after I get done. I'm filling up all my squares with petals. How many petals will we have when we're finished? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 petals. making all those quilt squares isn't the only fun part of quilting. Remember when I said everybody used to get together to have a big party to stitch all of the quilts together? Putting the quilt together is lots of fun too. These ladies are working on this quilt on a frame. The frame keeps the fabric tight and still so they can work on the stitches. And in case you're wondering what the back side of a quilt looks like, the squares that get stitched together for that top layer of the sandwich look pretty messy on the back. See how there's lots of extra fabric all folded over and laying around messy? That's one of the reasons that we hide it in the middle of the sandwich. If you're working all by yourself, nowadays it helps to have this thing called a quilting arm. See how long it is and it stretches over, and you can just move it back and forth to make any kind of design that you want on top of that quilt. It's a lot easier if you're all by yourself. Since we don't have a sewing machine, we could use a piece of paper to make it look like we stitched it all together. I'm using one of those little rectangles that I cut off when I made a square, and I'm just drawing a bunch of squares next to each other. And then inside, I'm gonna draw a whole bunch of different patterns that I make up on my own using whatever ideas I have. This quilt was made by my great-grandmother on my other side. This was my dad's mom's mom that made it. This quilt is made from 4 different quilt squares that my great-grandmother had made. She had made a bunch of quilt top squares to make a quilt, but she hadn't put the quilt together. And my aunt found these and then put them together for all of her grandkids. So you can see my grandmother had a dress that maybe didn't fit anymore, or maybe had holes or stains or something. And so she put these together in this leaf pattern. Here's another one. Here's another one. And here's another one. You can see on this one, everywhere where there's a brown stripe, probably the ink or the dye that they used, it's starting to fall apart. And so the quilt has these little tiny little holes in it, because sometimes clothing fabric doesn't make the best quilting fabric. But you can see on the inside, there's that batting that I was talking about, the squishy part that makes the quilt warm. So then my aunt went back and stitched with a machine and quilted all of the parts together and finished up the quilt to make just a nice little reminder of my great-grandmother. But what do you do if you have lots of extra fabric scraps but not enough to make a pattern? You make a crazy quilt. Crazy quilts can have patterns, like little bits of patterns, or no patterns at all. They could just be pieced together with scraps and bits and all kinds of things. The crazier the better with a crazy quilt. Big pieces, little pieces, crazy pieces, anything goes with a crazy quilt. I love it. I'm making my crazy quilt out of construction paper, but if you had scraps of fabric or paper scraps, that would be extra fun to use for this quilt. Don't forget to go back and add color and patterns to all of your quilt squares. Make sure your grown-up sends us a picture and tag us at HISD Fine Art so we can see the work you're doing. I can't wait. Bye, everybody. I've had so much fun with you guys today. I'll see you next week. Have a good week.